I'm now going to pronounce these names all wrong, but you know what I mean. I mean well. We are ready for our session on philosophy and imagination with Barbara Cassin, Divya Dwivedi, that was easy, Shaj, Mohan, and Patrice, Maniglier. Thank you. Please take your seats and enrich us. Thank you.
Bonjour. Good afternoon. Namaskar. I am Patrice, the director of Alliance Française du Bengal, your official French Cultural and Language Center in your city. And I just come 2 minutes to introduce the speakers and introduce the event today. Of course, we are part of CALAM, and this session is part of Bonjour India. Bonjour India is a world festival during 3 months in India, promoted by the Embassy of France, Institut Français in Delhi, and Alliance Française in India. And this session is also part of La Nuit des Idées. Well, about Bonjour India, it's all about partnership, creativity, innovation, and a lot of events will happen until the end of the winter. This month, the next month, please follow all the events on Alliance Française website and Bonjour India website. A lot of things will happen about literacy, dance, etc. This session is also part of La Nuit des Idées. Since now 3 years, every year at the same date, all the French network in the world organize La Nuit des Idées with some authors and philosophers. And this year, the slogan of La Nuit des Idées, the Night of Ideas, is power to imagination. Thank you. This year in India, the Night of the Idea expand in a week of philosophy. And our 4 philosophers come from France and India, were in Delhi before to be here in Calcutta, and all together we go next to Borotalpada in West Bengal with Trimukhi platform. Who are the speakers today? Divya Dwivedi is professor of philosophy and literature at Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. Her research areas include ontology of the literary, narratology, and critical philosophy of race. Shaj Mohan is research and publication concerned metaphysics, reason, philosophy and technology, and politics. Shaj and Divya wrote together a philosophical monograph on Gandhi and philosophy on theological anti-politics. And our 2 guests from France, Barbara Cassin and Patrice Maniglier. Barbara Cassin and Patrice Maniglier, 2 of the greatest philosophers nowadays in France. Barbara Cassin is Director of Research at the CNRS and President of the Collège International de la Philosophie. Trained as a specialist of ancient Greece, her research focuses on what words can do, particularly sophistic and rhetoric. You have been translated in 20 languages. You received from the Académie Française the Grand Prix de Philosophie. And you collaborated with Divya for La Revue des Femmes Philosophes, published by UNESCO, directed by you, and you contributed to this review. And last but not the least, Patrice Maniglier, who was already here last year in Calcutta for CALAM. He's made the conference at Paris-Nanterre University and specialist, among many others, specialist of Sansor and Foucault. I will not make the list of all your writings. The mics are yours now. So today, the topic is philosophy and imagination. Please.
All right. Hello, everybody. So we decided since this is an unmonitored conversation between us, so we decided together that I will start the conversation. And so the way we will start is by giving a few remarks, I guess the four of us, one after the other, and then starting the conversation, and I suppose then opening the conversation to you as quickly as possible. I think we have, what, 50 minutes? Or an hour? 50 minutes? Yeah? All right. So the topic of the conversation tonight is philosophy and imagination. So I think it's actually of good sense to start by remarking that philosophy is not very often associated with imagination. It's associated with its contrary, or its supposed contrary, which is reason. And I think that, on the contrary, actually, the kind of philosophy I am interested in, which I am ashamed to say is the French philosophy of the 60s onwards, is characterized precisely by a gesture, a very strong gesture, which has been to put imagination at the center of what philosophy should do, or to consider philosophy as an exercise in imagining things, and not in what? Well, very often philosophy has been considered as a way of rationalizing, introducing more reason into the world, and very often in trying to find what is necessary, what we should necessarily think, or what we should necessarily do. And that perspective, which is the foundational perspective, trying to find the ultimate grounds for everything, for thoughts and for action, is, I think, what has been challenged in more recent philosophy by the idea that philosophy is more about precisely changing how we could look at things, or how we could perceive them, how we could envisage our own action. So in the theoretical and the moral world, trying to find other ways. Here this event is also organized, as Fabrice said, as part of a worldwide program led by the French Institute, which turns around the slogan of May 68 in Paris, which was l'imagination au pouvoir. So power to imagination, or imagination should come in power. So it's interesting to see that there is a kind of connection between a particular trend of philosophy and a particular moment in political history, where imagination has been considered as a central thing. I think this is an interesting moment. Nonetheless, I would like to say that imagination is a rather tricky notion. Because on the one hand, who wouldn't like to have imagination? Everybody, to lack imagination is normally not considered to be a very good thing. So everybody wants imagination. But actually, I think imagination might be, again, a kind of trap. Because what is imagination? I think imagination is a sensitivity to possibilities rather than actual states of affairs. So to have imagination is to have that capacity to sense the variations that are not yet actualized and that may not be actualized ever. So that is a very good thing indeed, maybe, but it's also a very limiting thing. Why? Because in fact, what is really new, when something new happens, it precisely happens as something that cannot be imagined, as the unimaginable. So I think that more interesting than imagination is the unimaginable. And here I am in view very specific events. So that could be political events, it could be scientific events, it could be artistic events, but there are things that actually transgress the limits of imagination. And let me give you just an example, which is an example in mathematics. So many people would think that mathematics is not an exercise in imagination, and that is completely wrong. Mathematics is an exercise in imagination, of course. And it's an example from Cantor, the German mathematician who invented set theory. And when he discovered a particular, what he calls a continuous, that is the fact that in a segment of a line, of real numbers, there is as many numbers, that is an infinity, as in the entire line. So how can you have as much in the part as in the whole? And when he demonstrates that, Cantor has this beautiful phrase. He writes to his friend Dedekind, another mathematician, and he says, I can see it, but I cannot believe it. So that's the kind of things I am personally interested in. Those moments where something unimaginable forces you to reframe the way you think. And I actually believe that that's what philosophy is about. Philosophy is about reconstructing or repairing the broken frame of apprehension of things. And of course, then the question is, well, those disruptive events, they do not come from nowhere. So there must be something in the very nature of the situations in which we are that makes it possible for things which are beyond the possibility itself to occur. And that, I think, is very fascinating. That is, there's something that makes it possible, that makes the impossible somehow possible, without making it really possible, otherwise it wouldn't be the impossible anymore. Well, I have a particular answer to what that is. It's called a structure, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But just to say that this is actually, I think, a very sort of it's a horizon for contemporary philosophy, to understand what it is that makes the impossible, in fact, possible, without preempting, without pre-deciding the impossible. That, I think, is really what we should work on nowadays. At least that's what I'm working on. Voila, that's just my first preliminary remarks. Maybe Divya can continue. Well, you have your own mic.
Thank you, Patrice, for beginning the co-meditation on philosophy and imagination, which is the title of this session of the meet. And of course, there's a slogan under the sign of which we are beginning this discussion. But after you've already begun, I will permit myself to begin again. And in a way, I would think that literature is precisely something that begins again. And I now mention literature, although it's not in the title of this session, because we are, after all, meeting in a literary meet. And what does it mean to have met like this and to have a session on philosophy and imagination in a literary meet? There are a number of things, but the first thing is that when we think of philosophy, we in fact think of a history of contestations, and contestations are like battlefields, actions in battlefields where philosophers meet. So definitely there are meetings in philosophy, and philosophers often argue with each other, meeting on the same topic, for instance, the problem of being or the problem of truth, very old problems. Or else they meet in, or else they monitor meetings, for instance, by looking out where an encroachment may happen in a certain territory of concepts. So, for instance, there's often a kind of monitoring of whether the phenomenal is encroaching on the territory of the transcendental. So these are the ways in which we definitely have meetings in philosophy. But on the other hand, what is a literary meet, and what is it to meet in literature? You think of a series of writers, and each is different from the other. And this is particularly the case with great writers. In a way, to be great, for a work of literature to be great, means that it almost doesn't meet. It really stands alone, stands by itself. And of course, we often find literary works being congregated, being gathered under, say, themes. So we have novels of war, novels of love, novels of peace. Maybe that's more rare. And we also have other kinds of meetings of literature. For instance, very commonly we think of literary genres, and these are the ways in which we fall into thinking about literature. But on the other hand, because great literature does not meet, that is why we have a literary meet. That is why we are gathered, because we are trying to come together to think of something that is not going to lend itself on its own to a meeting, because it stands by itself. In a way, it withdraws from interpretation. And that has definitely something to do with imagination, because literature is a child of imagination. So that is an extremely important way of asking the question of imagination. What is it to imagine? Who imagines? What is the being that is that is imagined? I mean, is it a simple transitive operation that, you know, philosophy, like Patrice said, is about? And that is the operative preposition. But when we say imagine, what is the operative preposition for imagining? So imagination obviously creates things, and we have creation in many fields, in many disciplines. A famous philosopher like Deleuze would say that everything is creation, and philosophy too is creation. And yet, is philosophy the object, the thing that is brought into being by creation, which is specifically imaginative? It's not an easy set of questions to quickly think about, whereas a word like imagination in a way is very quickly accessible to us. So I want to begin again by keeping in view literature, and the reason is that this problem of the preposition, the problem of the transitivity with respect to philosophy on the one hand, it's always about something, maybe a secondary discourse, or on the other hand, literature, which really has the independence of a transitive being. We have to remind ourselves that imagination as a faculty, let us say compared to reason or compared to sense, apprehension, you know, Kant is of course the first one to come to mind. When we think of this distinction between, say, thinking with reason and then working with imagination, when does this concept of imagination actually emerge? Could we say that it comes a bit late? It has not been there from the beginning, but we still have had works like Plato's dialogue Ion, where he's also talking about different kinds of generation, production, and he in fact links creation to inspiration and to madness. And this is in the dialogue of a philosopher who we think has in a way encapsulated the whole history of philosophy. So imagination as a term is late, but on the other hand, there seems to be something which is older than that. So I will stop here and maybe resume some of the other things Patrice said, and also look forward to the things that Barbara and Shaj will say. But with this set of concerns in my own mind as we meet in a literary meet to talk about philosophy and imagination.
Well, between philosophy and literature, I think there is a word in common, at least. It's image. And imagination is a word made with the word image. And I would like to first maybe to say what for me is imagination. Imagination is the power of leaving the words and the images work. It's a way of being surprised by what can happen with images and with words that conveyed or that are conveyed by images. And my first surprise is with the word imagination itself, you know, made with image in Latin and with a specific Latin word, which is imago. Imago means first the portrait of the dead people. This is an imago. And also the portrait of the people you don't see anymore, and of the gods because you don't see them. So it leads to see what you don't see. This is the first meaning. And if you put it in Greek, imago has been a translation. Imagination is a translation of fantasia. Fantasia, you hear fantasy. You hear all the foolish things that are under fantasy. All the mad thing. We've said that imagination was the mad woman in the house. You know, it's a sentence of Malebranche. And she likes to be mad. And that's why philosophers are so maddened by imagination. So fantasia, let us just stop a little moment at this word. Fantasia is made on phos. Phos means light. It means more than that. You know, it's a Sanskrit. It's a Sanskrit root, something like b. And it means at the same time the light, the uttering of the voice, and the mortality of the mortal. That is at least what the Greek felt in this word, phos. So you see how complex and how imaginative it is. Imaginary. So now let me just stress an example of what imagination can do in philosophy. What images could provide in rationality and in politics. And I want to compare two ways of being imagined, being seen as images of the city-state, Plato and Aristotle. For Plato, a city is imaged as a body. It has a head, it has a breast, it has a belly. You have a philosopher king, you have warriors, and you have agricultors or people who workers. And this is a city-state. And it has to be organized. It's an organic thing. And if you want to behave well, you have to behave in this kind of organic order. And you see how it is pregnant for nowadays in a way. Now, let us take another image. It is a counter image made by Aristotle against Plato in a way, in politics. He said, well, if I have to find other images, not a body, not equipage in a boat, not all these type of things, but something really belonging to a new kind of city-state, which is democracy. I will say it's something like a picnic. Everybody is coming and bring something different, and so it's happy and funny and good. Of course, if everybody is bringing the same tomatoes, it will be disgusting. But if everybody comes with its own part, with its own provision, that will be nice. So you see how, for me, the power of imagination is stressed by those possibilities that images are opening and reopening in rationality itself. That's why if imagination is a mad woman in philosopher's home, we are all very happy to have a woman a little bit mad. Thank you.
It's on? Okay. You can define imagination also as a faculty that allows us to conceive something that is not here, something which has not been exhausted by all our searches or all our activities. So in that sense, as the last person to speak, I'll try to capture if something, if it was escaping. So we can conceive imagination that way. But there are many ways in which this word can be used. One, a faculty which functions under an image. Now, this is the way in which Baumgarten, or to an extent Hume, and particularly Kant would use it. And for Kant, it is also a necessary faculty, and therefore it is also a kind of crisis in Kant's architecture. It simply means this, that you have very pure concepts, which means pure concept means that concepts without any empirical content. And on the other hand, you have the instantiations of that concept. So one example would be a circle and a dinner plate. So how do you bring these two things together? So the task of bringing things from two distinct faculties, from two extremes, together is given to the faculty called imagination. Now, what Kant said about this faculty can be summarized by what he himself said. He said that this is the most mysterious faculty obscured in the deepest part of our minds. So in that sense, so when we speak about imagination, it is already something unimaginable, right? So what is imagination itself is a difficult thing to conceive. And at the same time, we all know that we all have imagination. In fact, we claim a certain right in every moment of our lives. When somebody who is adolescent, when that person wants to deviate from the ways of their parents, and that person already knows what is imagination because he or she can conceive of something different. Or when someone makes a work of art, the task already is that I want to deviate from the history of this particular art. Even a philosopher wants to come up with a concept which nobody had conceived up to that point. So in that sense, there is something transgressive. We associate something transgressive and something subversive, something even violent in the idea of imagination. But who has the power to imagine? And it is here that we should briefly meditate on the phrase power to imagine, which appeared as a slogan during May 68. Why power to imagination? We should think about it. You know, they could have created a slogan called the power of imagination, which philosophers would easily understand. And as a faculty, you know, the power of imagination is a faculty. Faculty means that it's a power that is given to you. And instead, what the slogan says is that power must be given to imagination, which means that there are things which prevent people from imagining a distinct way of life, imagining distinct ways of practicing art. So imagination in that sense is political. So the limit of imagination, yes, to an extent, the limit of imagination is in our conception within philosophy. Philosophers can indeed, through conceptual devices, release certain powers of imagination. But at the same time, imagination is also constrained by political acts or political situations. So this aspect of imagination, if we could begin to think about, I think, yes. Is it shut? Is it?
The problem is that we have no master, no guide. So would you like to ask question or make remarks? We will be very happy of that, or maybe you...
We can just exchange on what we've said, and just very quickly, one thing I would like to add to what has been said, which I think is actually quite convergent through the four of us, is that so we could look at imagination as a faculty, but we could also look at it as a dimension of reality, and it's not as a dimension of reality. So it's not a subjective faculty; it's something. It is a part of reality. For instance, so you can say that before coming here, maybe you imagined something. I hope you're not too disappointed. But therefore, it would come from you. This situation not being present at the moment when you were thinking of coming, you generated an image, and therefore you imagined something. That's one way of looking at it, but you could look at it in a different way. You could think that imagination is in fact the mode of existence of possibilities. That is, that this event, or even your being present here, is a possibility, and that possibility is actually real. And the way we sense that possibility, the way that possibility exists, is through imagination. So that's another way of looking at it, which I find more exciting, because I find it more imaginative. I find it more exciting because I think it's more difficult to think about it.
Maybe I can start a couple of questions and then more can be built up if we have to really move to this imaginary place which can begin again or which is something new or which deviates. I think there are different accents that each of us has been putting on the relation between philosophy and imagination and on imagination itself. And so one of the questions that emerges is, what is the relationship between the possible and the real? Of course, again, we have a number of thinkers who have contributed to conceiving this relationship. And Deleuze, for instance, even says that the possible is something that is retroactive. And either we have to accept it and then rethink the problem, or we have to set aside this definition. So I think this could be a question that is posed to us. Now, what does it mean for possibility to be retroactive? It means that it's always from what we already have that we imagine what we don't have. And it could be a very simple logical operation of what is not there. So how is it that we really make departures which are not dictated by the present reality? And this is also a problem of imagining, because when we think of new places, there's another term that immediately we recognize, and that is utopias. Now, of course, by definition, there are no places, they don't exist. But we also know the danger of utopias. While we might think that these are the grand new places we want to build, this is also an old problem in philosophy. And again, one thinks of Plato, because his utopia, the Republic, is indeed a frightening place. And we have had many such utopias. So again, is there a direction that philosophy tends to take with no places or with imagination that is a problem? Or do we have to imagine philosophy itself anew? And Shaj and Barbara both spoke of politics. For instance, when Barbara talked about the city, I had another set of questions arising, and that is that you look at, again, the city from the very beginning of philosophy in Dialogues of Plato, or the city in, say, Roman literature, and you think of the city as, first of all, a constructed place. It was not always there. The city itself had to be imagined, and objects like rights which define the city. What is a city? It's a place where there are citizens. And when we think of the Roman city, you think of a couple of things, like the slave rebellion through which the history of the empire passes, or you think of the citizens who withdraw to the hilltop. They leave the city as a threat that they can actively make in order to insist on their right to the city. And so what is this thing called a right? Did it always exist? Was it the product of imagination? So these are also very important questions, intimately linked with city, politics, imagination, and philosophy.
If I can add something on 68. May 68 is everywhere there with power to imagination. That was really the moment we felt that possibilities were opened. But of course, I agree with Patrice when he said that you cannot imagine it, imagination is the imagination of the unimaginable. But what is more extremely strange in imagination is that you imaginate only the unimaginable, but with the means of the images you already have. In the framework, in the frame of the images you know. And that was, this is really a paradoxical. The paradox is that you have to find new things with old ones. But completely, radically new, but with what you have. And for me, one of the moments, the most inventive in 68, was the slogans. The slogans, take two of them. First one, under the pavé, you know, under the road, the things that are on the road. I don't know.
The street stones?
The stones in the street. Under
the
stones.
Under the pavement, yeah.
The
right.
pavement. The beach. The beach is under the pavement. Sous les pavés, la plage. That was extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily creative. And it is a rearrangement of images we live in. And it is this type of new syntax that could be so precious, you know. I have another example in mind with the slogan, with the 68 slogan, which is, you know that Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, said, God is dead. And on the walls, there were, God is dead, said Nietzsche. Nietzsche is dead, said God. Well, of course, it's just a rearrangement it's a new syntax of old things. And this could be maybe the most strange power, the most strange empowerment in imagination for me. And this is very politics. And you see, when I was telling about the body as a city and the picnic as a city, of course, it's nothing but new syntax of old images.
I think I'll say something about the complexity of imagination at the same time, particularly in order to come to politics. So earlier I mentioned the philosopher Kant, and he is the philosopher who defined a place for imagination as something which stands between concepts and the empirical or intuitions. Now, in order to define the activity performed by imagination, he had to find another word. So this activity would be called schematism or the schema. Now, schema itself is actually not saying much, because Kant says imagination performs schema. He might as well have said imagination performs imagination, because schema, it's the Greek word. It means figure, it means shape, form. So again, it is a kind of doubling. It is a kind of difficulty we have with this word. So do we say, is imagination really a faculty related to the possible or the impossible? I'm trying to think here. And if it is the possible, if it is to delineate all the possibilities and find the threshold of the possibilities of something, that faculty has already classically been assigned to reason from the medieval time onwards. So a philosopher like Leibniz would say that the essence of a thing is the concept we make of all the possibilities it can have. But on the other hand, imagination exceeds, in a way, our capability to think possibilities, because possibilities require a certain set of conditions. But imagination is also about conceiving new conditions. And that's where I think Barbara's idea and the direction that we should think about slogans. Slogans may seem like very trivial thing, or slogans may seem like very fun things to chant. But we do some sloganeering, and then after a while we all get tired, or a fatigue begins to set in. Why is there a fatigue? Because a slogan is a demand. Because a slogan demands merely this, that, you know, for example, grant power to imagination. Who should grant it? You should grant it. Which means you have to do the work in order to build the conditions under which something new can emerge. Rather, a possibility always relies on an older set of conditions. So a slogan demands that you build newer conditions.
Okay. So is there a mic?
Sorry. I just wanted to ask you about the point you just made. Are you talking about personal sloganeering in when you say that a slogan needs a demand, a slogan has a demand, and that you should give it the respect it deserves? So is this at a mass level or at a personal level?
It can be anything, you know. For example, you can give a slogan about, I want to be a great painter. That's sufficiently a slogan. For example, if you don't have the conditions to be a painter, you know, to be a great painter is not to imitate the existing painters. If you paint like Rubens or Picasso, you wouldn't be a great painter, because in fact, Picasso did say that by the time he was 15 years old, he could paint like all the classical painters, and he didn't feel like a painter, right? So when you say that I want to be a great painter, and that is your slogan, which means that it is asking you to develop the conditions under which painting itself can be imagined differently, which does not ever fall into the lines of possibilities which history of painting had conceived. Yes.
What I want to say, that imagination, does it run on the time scale, past, present, and future? Because even of the past things, we think that how it happened, how it will happen, and what is it today, reality, how it came up. So imagination is describing, does it describe all these things on the time scale? What do you feel about it? And then all these scientific developments and other things which have come up, there is a part of imagination which has actually come up reality. In future also, some more thing will happen. So somebody, I told yesterday also about sixth sense thing which has been done by one Indian in America. So he imagined something and it is happening. So imagination has got a vast scale, time scale, as well as the phenomenal scale. There are three images here. Somebody imagined, and then he created it, and it happened. So how this imagination has got a great phenomena, and this all aspects are covered, I want to know, how do you feel about it?
Thank you. So yeah, you're right. I think there's an imagination of the past. I don't know if this is what you meant, but there is something called counterfactual history. So a form of making history that consists in imagining other possibilities, just like in this novel by Philip Roth called The Plot Against America, where he imagines, or at least he narrates, the story of a young Jewish boy in the United States in the 30s, but in a country in which Lindenberg, who was a fascist, sort of fascist leader at that time, who didn't come into power because Roosevelt was elected, but he imagines a world in which this guy would come into power, and he tells the story of what would have happened. And historians, so he's a novelist, but historians do that too, and that's actually, I think, a way of bringing intelligibility. Why? Again, because I think the possibilities, or maybe I should have said the virtualities, because there's a distinction here, because you reminded us that Deleuze defines possibility by the retroaction on the past, but that's true of the notion of possibility, but that's not true of the notion of virtuality. And the virtual is not exactly the same as the possible. The possible basically can be defined just as a representation, where the virtual is really a dimension of reality. And so that's why counterfactual history could be a form of history, because those possibilities were there. And this is deeply what I think about 68. I think of that 68 means a lot of virtualities that have not been actualized, but that doesn't mean that they were not real. That's something important. I don't know. Many things were said by you that I cannot reply to because it would take too long, but thank you very much.
Actually, could I just follow up that for 1 minute? You've mentioned 68, and it's been a motif which has occurred twice now. But the reading of 68 in one context with one set of images will run one way. When you actually transpose it across the world into other contexts, it will run in a very, very different way. And in fact, the fourth speaker has pointed to this issue of a certain politics, a set of conditions within which images actually evolve. There are different, as it were, image lineages across the world. Practically all of you have, I think at one level, been dealing with certain discourses which occur within a Euro-American set of references. Now, at certain times, there are grand dialogues that take place within this, so that assumptions which come from other traditions, whether it be Indian or Chinese or elsewhere in the Middle East, they tend to suddenly cast very, very powerful images across spaces. Is there, when you're actually breaking the box, when you're actually thinking in terms of possibilities and nuances, these actually open up remarkable possibilities. I mean, in fact, actually, you're talking about Gandhi, or two of you are. I think Gandhi's a great instance of one such person who's responding to two different such image units. This is a very specific question to the four of you, which is, how far do you consider that there has been a kind of polarization politically of this particular attempt to think in terms of images, imagination, and the world of philosophy? That is, that a series of nuances which have been generated in other contexts somewhere tend to come up. They did during the 20s and the 30s, certainly. But then retreat to the point where they don't actually hold any central spot at all. I know, for instance, that Barbara has been writing a good deal on politics for all and philosophy for all and similar such issues. But who is all in this particular case? Are there different, who is all in this particular case? Is it essentially only individuals straddling the globe or communities straddling the globe? So that's a question really that all of you in your final response can perhaps take up.
Well, maybe I'm going just to say one very quick word. I think indeed that, if I have understood your question well, because it was about the diversity of philosophical traditions and the way they can impact the way we look at imagination. That was the question, right? And in fact, before coming here, when we were discussing about what we were going to say, I said, well, in fact, I think the real discipline of imagination for me is the discipline called anthropology, which is a comparative thought, basically. And precisely because comparison, and then I will leave the ground to Barbara, because she's a very good expert about comparison and translation. But I think precisely it's all about that it's a movement by which you, using your own resources, because what else would you use? You're not going to stop being the one you are, or the one you have been formed to be, right? So you are the one you are, but using those resources, you're actually trying to enter not only in a different form of thinking, way of thinking, but in a way of thinking that opens up a space in which you retroactively come to realize that you were just a particular case or a variant of a larger thing. So it's not a matter of being within one tradition or within another tradition. It's a matter of remapping one another through the comparison and translations. But maybe Barbara has more to say about that.
Well, I just agree that we are who we are, so closed in something that we try to break. And that anthropology and translation, if we understand translation as know-how, or trying to know how with differences, are parts of these tools to break our own box. But when I say that, I also feel absolutely in my box. Because for example, I am really thinking of Jacques Derrida saying that if he had to define deconstruction in a very rough and simple and direct way, the best way, he said, it will be more than one tongue, more than one language. This will be the best definition for him of deconstruction. That is to say, absolutely no Greek, absolutely being out of our box, our Greek box, the one I displayed usually, because Greek are Hellenists and Hellenizein, the same word, means at the same time to be, to speak Greek, to be cultivated, to be a good man, and etc. Just as logos means rationality, speech, Greek language. So you have the one that you are, the point is that it's very difficult not to think that you are universal, that you are the universal. And this is the point of colonization and decolonization. Of course, this is here that we have to find it. How to break the box, I'm not sure it's possible, but we can, being aware of that we are in, even when we are thinking we are not. For example, with deconstruction. Deconstruction is a pure effect, more than one language, translation, etc. It's perfectly fitting with our European actual tradition. Do you propose something else?
Let me also add another note to the questions. In fact, the three questions have something related. The question about slogans, about the past in a way which led to this chain of conversation where Shaj talked about syntax, and then your question about the different pasts and traditions. And I have someone in mind right now that I have come away from listening to just a couple of days ago. That was Professor Romila Thapar, who speaks about, in fact, multiplicity of pasts, multiple voices, and how they don't terminate. Now, if we accept that the pasts that make us don't terminate, then this is the slightly different note I would like to strike on the word all, and also the idea of from where do we imagine, the resource that helps us to imagine or to create or to do anything. If we say it is ourselves, is it more than one? Is it a self that is entirely in our control in order to marshal, in order to send to different destinies? Or maybe the resource we have is itself something that I would like to call indestinate. And I will explain it in a moment, but if we think of the word all, maybe not as universal, not as something which is a common denominator, but as something quite indefinite. When we say some and all, perhaps there's another way outside of a certain tradition of quantification where the word all doesn't really tell us anything specific, but it does tell us that there is something more. Now, when it comes to, say, the subject that imagines a literary work or an artistic work, we have this difficulty. We don't know if this subject is one, if this subject is oneself, and if this subject is one tradition. So maybe if we alter our question itself, we will get a very different scenario, a very different landscape of both politics and imagination. So traditions definitely are built. Traditions require a lot of hard work of some people. I don't know if all participate in it, and if all did, maybe we would not have something like a tradition. There's something high about any tradition. And you've invoked Gandhi. It's such an interesting invocation because, you know, looking closely through a lot of scholarship in Gandhi's own enormous writings, we find so many traditions not coming to terminate at him. You know, the whole library of Gandhi is full of works from Jainism, from Christianity to certain kinds of Hindu ideas which he derived from other people. And I think of writers like Vijayan, who are themselves marked by 68. They are marked by the Prague Spring. That's another revolution that happens very close to May 68, and we don't forget it. And he says he left the party. He left one high tradition because Imre Nagy was shot. I have a sense that we are running short of time, but maybe I've hinted something with this, and Shaj might want to add something.
I'd like to say something. I believe that this question comes from what we can sort of generally indicate as post-colonial theory. And this is a serious problem. And it's also a kind of a generational problem in India. Because the theory, when it came, it divided an earlier generation of academics and intellectuals from each other. And today, my generation doesn't have any kind of sentiment at all regarding this theory. We don't live according to the same post-colonial conditions in which a previous generation lived. And further, post-colonial theory, the difficulty of questions regarding post-colonial theory and the questions which come from it is that there is a kind of quest for a kind of nostalgia, a feeling for a home, and so on. So post-colonial condition, definitely it exists, but I don't think that post-colonial theory ever was adequate to it. What it has done is that in the condition, you have a kind of unhomeliness. If anybody asks me which language in which I dream, I don't know. I mean, which is the language I feel at home? I don't know. I feel very unhomely. And it's fantastic because it is only in the unhomely that imagination actually functions. Yes.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you,
To emphasize how
Yes.
odd it is that we are here speaking in reference to May 68 in such a context. So I suggest that we actually tag the walls.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for our philosopher. 4 philosophers are too much for 50-minute sessions. We are still on the spot few minutes if some people want to speak to you, maybe exchange with you, but we have to leave the stage now, really. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Divya. Thank you, Patrice. Thank you, Shaj.